For today's online lesson, we're going to take a look at memory and look at some of the anatomy that underlies this particular cognitive process. One type of memory is declarative memory. You might think of this as your what and when memory. And it's memory that's available to conscious recollection as specific stimuli, such as facts or events. It's going to require a healthy hippocampus for you to develop or consolidate new declarative memories. For you to learn new information, such as the information in this course, you would need a healthy hippocampus while you were learning it so that you could recall it later. There's a couple of different types of declarative memory. One type is semantic memory, and this is memory for facts, ideas, and general information. Again, things that you might use to learn about a history class or recall ideas from a textbook. The other type of declarative memory is episodic memory. And you want to think about this as episodes, like episodes from your life. And so it's memory for events. And so we're going to think about these memories in terms of their time and in terms of their context. In addition to declarative memory, we also have non-declarative memory. And these are typically perceptual and motor memory, or you can think of it as how-to memory. It tends to be more automatic and tends to control behavior, and does not rely on the hippocampus for formation. So if you think about learning how to ride a bicycle, or how to type, or how to do a certain motor task, such as shooting free throws, those are going to be motor memories that you're going to maintain and can continue to learn even in the absence of a healthy hippocampus. One example of a task that's considered a non-declarative memory task is the mirror tracing task. Here you're going to trace various shapes, like the star in this example, but you're not going to look at your hand. You're actually going to look at the mirror reflection of your hand. So things are going to be reversed. As you can see, early on you make many errors, but as time goes on, you actually can demonstrate an ability to learn that. What is interesting about this is that amnesic patients can also demonstrate this motor learning. If you go in and say, hey, I'm here with the mirror tracing task, and maybe it's day 4, they might not recognize you, and they cannot state declaratively that they know that they can do this particular task, or that they've ever seen this task before, but they can demonstrate how they can do it. So again, it's going to demonstrate their motor ability, something that they've learned, and their behavior will demonstrate that by having very few errors, even though they can't state explicitly that they've ever seen the task before. One other type of memory that is important is spatial memory. You might think of this as your where memory, and this is memory for where things are or where you are. And it can be important for wayfinding and certainly navigation. Knowing how to get from point A to point B, you're going to use spatial memory. And animals use this memory as well. This also requires a healthy hippocampus, and if you have damage to your hippocampus, your spatial memory is seriously impaired. Research with rats looking at the Morris water maze, which is a classic spatial memory task for them, demonstrates this. Animals who have had their hippocampus removed before they learn this particular task. There is a hidden platform below the surface of the water. They're put in, and they have to kind of use the spatial cues to find the platform, and over several days can learn this task. Without the hippocampus, they never learn the task. They might bump into the platform and find it, but you bring them in the next day and they cannot demonstrate the learning. Conversely, if an animal learns the task very well, learns where the platform is, swims around and finds it, and does this for 3 to 7 days, and then you take the hippocampus out, what we find is that the animal can find the platform just fine, so long as you don't move the platform. So it's important to note that the hippocampus is going to be important for helping us consolidate new spatial memories, but it is not where those memories happen to be stored. And we'll talk about where memory is going to be stored a little bit later. Some anatomy related to memory that you'll want to be familiar with, certainly the hippocampus. And we want to think about, well, what information is going into the hippocampus, and also what information is the hippocampus sending out, and who is it talking to. The hippocampus receives information from the entorhinal cortex, and this cortex receives input from the amygdala, the limbic system, association areas of the neocortex, the pararhinal cortex, and the parahippocampal cortex. So there's a lot of information coming into the entorhinal cortex before it's getting passed on to the hippocampus. In addition, the hippocampus also receives input via the fornix from the ventral tegmental area, and this is going to include dopamine and information about reinforcement, certainly important for learning about new associations. The locus coeruleus, which is going to relate to noradrenaline or norepinephrine. The Raphe nuclei, which is going to communicate with serotonin, as well as the mammillary bodies. The hippocampus is going to send its outputs back to the entorhinal cortex, as well as the perirhinal and parahippocampal cortices, which are going to project back to the association areas of the cortex. So like many of our systems, we see this loop going forward and backwards. So there's constant communication between the cortex and the hippocampus and back to the cortex. In this diagram, you'll see a number of the structures that we've been talking about that are related to the limbic system, certainly the mammillary bodies, as well as the amygdala and the hippocampus. And then you'll see the parahippocampal gyrus, which is right next to the hippocampus, as well as the area of the fornix. So you've got an idea of where some of these structures happen to be located, and that they're in fact, generally speaking, very close together. Research with a particular patient known as HM has been very important in understanding a lot of aspects of learning and memory, as well as the importance of the hippocampus. HM, as you hopefully read in your textbook, was a patient who had uncontrollable epilepsy. And he in fact had surgery to remove the medial temporal lobe on both sides of his brain, and this included the hippocampus, in an effort to control his epilepsy. It did a good job of that. However, the side effect, which is probably not too surprising to you, is that he had very severe amnesia. He had poor declarative and spatial memory after the surgery, very severe anterograde amnesia, as well as some retrograde amnesia. But there was a number of things he could recall from before the surgery. But he maintained non-declarative memory, meaning that he could learn new motor tasks, including that memory tracing task, or I'm sorry, the mirror tracing task that we talked about earlier. And pardon me. And in fact, when we look at his pattern, his learning pattern looks the same as somebody without amnesia. As I mentioned, HM had very severe anterograde amnesia, and this is the impairment in the ability to make new memories, particularly after some sort of brain damage or the onset of a neurodegenerative disease. Damage to the hippocampus or areas that project to the hippocampus are the sites that are typically associated with anterograde amnesia. Damage to the hippocampal formation can lead to anterograde amnesia, again in patients such as HM or RB, who's also mentioned in the textbook. But you may also associate the early stages of Alzheimer's disease with anterograde amnesia, in particular because what we're seeing is damage to the hippocampus, but what we're also seeing in terms of symptoms is the inability to learn new information. People with early stages of Alzheimer's disease struggle with new names and new places. Damage to the mammillary bodies can also lead to anterograde amnesia, which is a particular structure implicated in Korsakoff syndrome. And so again, it's important to note that the hippocampus itself may not be directly damaged, but if some of those inputs, such as the mammillary bodies, are damaged, the information that's going into the hippocampus is going to be affected, and that's going to influence learning and memory. As I mentioned earlier, the hippocampus is not where short or long-term memories are stored. However, the hippocampus is important for consolidating memory. It's important for getting memories from that very short-term area of the brain into the longer-term stores. And so without the hippocampus, you can't make new information stick for very long. Another form of amnesia is known as retrograde amnesia. And this is the inability to recall facts or events that happened before the brain damage occurred. What's interesting to note is that the longest-term memories are the least reliant on the hippocampus. Older memories caused less and less hippocampal activation, and in fact cause more activation of the frontal cortex. And so what we're seeing is that longer-term memories are going to trigger more areas of the cortex and rely less and less on the hippocampus because they've already been consolidated and stored.